At the height of his powers, Francisco Goya was untouchable. As first court painter to the Spanish crown, he moved through gilded halls with the ease of a man who had earned his place among kings. He painted royalty with a precision that flattered without lying, capturing the shimmer of silk and the weight of gold braid with a steady, confident hand. The Spanish Enlightenment was alive around him. Ideas were moving, society was shifting, and Goya sat at the center of it all, brush in hand, celebrated, and in demand. He was 50 years old and at the absolute peak of his craft. Today we're going deep on all of it, from the silence, the paranoia, to the paintings. So stick with me, and if this is your first time here, subscribe now because this is the kind of story we tell on this channel. When 1792 arrived, everything went silent. While traveling in southern Spain, Goya fell gravely ill. The exact nature of the illness has never been confirmed. Theories range from lead poisoning to a neurological disease to an autoimmune condition, but the outcome was absolute. He lost his hearing entirely. For a man whose life ran on conversation, on social energy, on the buzz of court life and artistic circles, the silence was not just a medical condition. It was a kind of amputation. Letters from that period show a man shaken in a way that went beyond physical recovery. He described vertigo, partial visual loss, and a disorientation that lingered long after his body stabilized. The world kept moving. He simply could no longer hear it moving. What followed was not an immediate breakdown, but something slower and in many ways more damaging. A creeping withdrawal from the version of himself he had built over decades. He returned to work because Goya was nothing if not driven. But something in the work had shifted. The royal portraits continued, but alongside them grew something else entirely. The Capriccios, a series of 80 aquatint etchings, published in 1799, announced that the celebrated court painter had developed a darker, more corrosive eye. He drew sleeping men haunted by owls and bats, grotesque figures cloaked in superstition, society eating itself alive in plain sight. The Enlightenment ideals he had once built were now being held up to a cracked mirror. These are not images of a content man. They were the images of someone who had been handling silence and used it to finally say what he actually thought. By 1819, Goya was 73 years old and done with the world as it had become. Spain had been gutted by the Peninsular War, the Inquisition had tightened its grip back around the country's throat, and the liberal reforms he had believed in were being dismantled one by one under Ferdinand VII's restoration. He was old, he was deaf, and he had watched his country betray almost everything he had hoped it would become. So he left. He simply purchased a 2-story farmhouse on the outskirts of Madrid, along the banks of the Manzanares River, and disappeared into it. The property had a name already attached to it by locals, the Quinta del Sordo, meaning the villa of a deaf man. Whether that name existed before Goya arrived or was given because of him depends on who you ask. But either way, it fit. The house gave him distance from a capital city that had grown hostile and unpredictable. He lived there with Lecadia Wise, a younger woman who served as his companion and housekeeper, and her daughter Rosario. It was a quiet life by most measures, isolated in the way that Goya seemed to increasingly need isolation. He had his garden, his view of the river, and his balls. For a brief period, that appeared to be enough. Then the yellow fever outbreak of 1819 reached him, and it nearly killed him. His friend and physician, Eugenio Arrieta, sat by his bedside and pulled him back from the edge. Goya later painted the scene himself, a harrowing image of his own body, half collapsed, glassy-eyed, being held upright by a man trying to force medicine into him. He survived, but the experience of confronting death that directly, at that age, after everything his body and mind had already absorbed, pushed something past its last boundary. Whatever distance he had kept between himself and the darkest corners of his thinking collapsed after that illness. It was after his recovery that he began painting the walls. This is the part that demands real attention, because the decision itself is strange in a way that gets glossed over too quickly. These were not canvases, they were not works commissioned for exhibition or sale. They were the interior walls of his dining room and his upper salon. The rooms where he ate, where he sat, where he moved through his daily life. He painted directly onto the plaster in oil, covering both floors of his house with 14 large-scale murals that depicted some of the most disturbing imagery of his entire career. There was no audience intended, there was no patron, and no one asked for them. Goya made them for a space that only he and the small household around him would ever occupy, which means they were not art in the transactional sense he had spent his life producing. They were something closer to an environment, a physical space shaped entirely by the interior of his mind. Living inside the house meant living inside whatever Goya had become by the end of his life, and he apparently saw no reason to make that a comfortable place to be. Of everything Goya put on those walls, Saturn devouring his sun is the one that has never let go of the people who've seen it. It hung on the lower floor in the dining room, which is a fact worth sitting with for a moment. This is not a painting made for a museum wall or a patron's gallery. It was made for the room where Goya ate his meals. The subject itself, Saturn, the Roman god of time and harvest, consuming one of his children to prevent a prophecy that his own offspring would one day overthrow him, was not new territory for European painting. Rubens had painted it in 1636, and his version was horrifying in the classical sense. Goya's version shares almost nothing with that tradition. The figure in his painting is not a god. It's something feral and hollow-eyed, knuckles white, mouth open in a way that reads less like mythology and more like a scream that was cuddled into appetite. The child is already half gone. There's no grandeur in it and no narrative distance. It pulls you into the act itself and gives you nowhere to stand. What makes the painting even more unsettling when you study it closely is the way it was made. There are no known preparatory sketches for the black paintings, no studies, no underdrawings that suggest Goya worked through the compositions the way he had spent a lifetime working through everything else. The brushwork in Saturn is thick, fast, and in a place almost violent in its application. Dark pigments pushed into plaster with a directness that does not suggest deliberation. Art historians noted that the technique reads as automatic in a way that was genuinely unusual for the period, as though the images were not designed so much as discharged. For a man who had built his reputation on control, on the rendering of silk and skin and royal posture, this was a profound departure. The craft was still there in the underlying anatomy, in the way light catches the god's knuckles, but The restraint was gone. Whatever filter Goya had maintained between his inner life and the surface of his work had been removed entirely. The Witch's Sabbath, which occupied the upper salon, operates on a different frequency but arrives at the same destination. A massive crowd of figures, deformed, ecstatic, and terrified, gathered around a dark central form, a goat-headed figure who presides over the assembly like a corrupt sermon. Goya had painted a version of this subject decades earlier as part of a series of The Duchess of Osuna, and that earlier work was eerie but contained, almost folkloric. This version is not contained by anything. The faces in the crowd are not faces so much as states of desperation, ranging from open mouths, blank eyes, and bodies pressed together without comfort or warmth. Goya had lived through the Spanish Inquisition's machinery, through public executions carried out in the name of religious order, through a war that tore his country apart with the brutality he documented in his disaster of war etchings. By the time he painted this wall, he had spent decades watching institutions, from the church, the crown, and enlightenment itself, promise order and deliver savagery. The Witch's Sabbath is not a painting about superstition. It's a painting about crowds and authority, and the human willingness to huddle around any dark shape that offers certainty. Goya had seen enough of history to know that the shape changes, but the huddle stays the same. Thank you for watching. Until the next one.